I am Emily, and I've got a story that I can't stop turning over in my head no matter how much I wish I could forget it. I keep replaying this one moment, the moment I said words I barely remember forming, only to have them tear my life apart. If I close my eyes, I'm right back at that crowded fundraiser, the kind with glittering champagne flutes and careful smiles. Everyone dressed in black tie to show off how well they fit in that world. I was buzzing on a mix of nerves and pride, standing there on my husband's arm, thinking I'd finally arrived. Alex was by my side, that easy confidence in every move he made. The conversation turned to something about how we'd met, how I caught his eye, and I, wanting to play the room, joked that I only married him for the status. People around us gave these forced laughs, like they weren't sure if I was serious, but I just flashed a grin, thinking everyone understood it was just witty banter. A harmless social quip to show I wasn't taking myself too seriously. But then I looked at Alex, and I could see something break in his eyes. It wasn't dramatic, no one else noticed, but I felt it in my gut. Later that night, I tried to brush it off, telling myself he'd forget about it. We were riding home in silence, and I put my hand on his arm. His tense muscles were enough of a warning, but I was too stubborn, too locked into my own image to realize what I'd done. We got home, and for the first time in our marriage, he didn't come to bed. The next morning, I went looking for him, still tired and vaguely uneasy, but there was no sign of him in the house. It was as if he'd vanished, leaving behind nothing but the echo of that look he'd given me at the party. And I told myself I was overthinking it, that everything was fine. I had no idea I was standing at the edge of a crumbling cliff, about to watch my whole life collapse. I pushed the memory of his wounded expression aside, convincing myself it was temporary. But when evening arrived, and he quietly skipped dinner without an excuse, I felt the first real twinge of fear. Something wasn't right, and I didn't know how to fix it, not yet ready to admit it was all my fault. A single careless comment, a boastful little joke, I couldn't see how it could kill our entire marriage. But then again, I hadn't realized just how much weight my words carried for him, or how quickly a small crack in our foundation could turn into something irreparable. I kept thinking I'd find a way to make him understand I didn't mean it, that it was all a silly performance for other people. But it was already too late for that. A chill had settled between us, and I kept telling myself tomorrow would be better. Except each new day seemed even colder, and the distance between us was growing. Though I refused to believe it was more than a phase, in my ignorance, I had no clue that I had set off a bomb. I went to bed that night alone, my mind spinning with excuses, determined to pretend I was still in control. But the truth was, I could already feel the ground shifting beneath my feet, and I refused to face the possibility that one thoughtless sentence could cost me everything. A part of me clung to the hope that, by morning, he'd be back by my side. I just had no idea how quickly that hope would vanish. I got up the next day, and he was in the kitchen reading something on his phone. His jaw was tight, and there was no sign of the smile he usually gave me. That smile that first drew me in years ago. I should have apologized right away. I should have said, "Alex, about last night, I'm so sorry for making that comment." But I was too proud or too scared or maybe just too stubborn to admit any real guilt. I hovered there, searching for a normal tone, something to break the ice. Instead, all I managed was a lame question about how he slept. His answer was barely a mumble, and then he stepped around me and walked out the door. When I heard the car pull away, I was left alone in that big, beautiful kitchen he'd renovated for me, a place I once bragged about to my friends, as if it was a reflection of my success, instead of his. I hated how hollow it felt, but I tried to shake it off. I had a lunch scheduled with a friend, a chance to show off a new designer bag, the one Alex had gifted me during better days. Everything felt normal enough on the surface, so I drove to the cafe with the lingering tension of our morning still stuck in my chest. At lunch, I tried to tell a funny story about the night before, leaving out the part that it ended in a silent argument. My friend, though, saw right through me. "Is something off?" she asked, and I quickly denied it. Later, I realized I was repeating the same mistake, turning my relationship into a prop for social posturing. Still, I didn't see how that was fueling the damage. I left that lunch feeling emptier than when I arrived. The city lights blurred as I went home, and I started noticing small signs that something was different. The front door was locked from the inside. Alex always left it open for me. His coat was missing from the rack, the one he always used. And in our bedroom, the closet door was half open, some of his usual clothes gone. It wasn't obvious enough to cause panic, but it was enough to make my heart pound. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. My palms were sweaty by the time I hung up. I wanted to text him to say sorry, but the words wouldn't come. It was just one slip of the tongue. After all, why should I grovel? There was a voice in my head telling me I should, but my pride was louder. At dinner, I waited and waited, and he didn't show. There was no text, no call, just the hum of the refrigerator in that lonely house. When my phone finally buzzed, it was only a brief message from him. Running late. Don't wait up. Nothing more, no explanation. I ended up going to bed alone again, telling myself that he was just busy, that this wasn't some massive turning point. I felt a prickle of unease, like the air was charged with something that was about to strike. But I swallowed it, thinking there was nothing to fear. As I tried to sleep, I replayed my words. I'm only with him for the status. Maybe it wasn't that big a deal. We both joked about things all the time. He'd understand. He had to, but as I drifted off, the knot in my stomach only tightened. I had no idea that morning would bring the first real sign that my entire life was about to be dismantled in the most precise and devastating way possible. When I woke up, I was determined to make things right, or at least go back to pretending everything was fine. But Alex was already gone, his side of the bed ice cold. I found his office door locked, something he'd never done before, and it unsettled me so much I nearly dropped my coffee mug. My mind started wandering to worst-case scenarios, but I forced myself to shower and dress like it was any other day. It was while I was putting on my shoes that I heard voices downstairs, male voices, calm and professional. That's when I noticed a black SUV parked out front, the kind that typically ferries around expensive lawyers or top-tier accountants. My blood turned to ice. I knew I should go down, see what was happening, but a wave of denial kept me rooted in place. Eventually, I forced myself to walk down, step by step, heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. I reached the living room to find Alex talking to two suited men I'd never seen before. Papers were spread across the coffee table. He paused, glancing up with an expression that felt like he'd become a stranger overnight. One of the men nodded politely at me, but Alex didn't introduce me. He simply said, "We're almost done here." That was it. No explanation, no invitation to join them. I hovered there, stunned, but managed a polite smile and backed away. A knot of dread twisted in my stomach. It was as if my worst fear was playing out, but I was powerless to stop it. Once they left, Alex walked to the kitchen, calmly pouring himself water. I asked who they were. He said, "Just some business," without looking at me. I pressed, my voice trembling with confusion, but he refused to elaborate. He finally glanced at me, and in that single look, I realized how furious he was. I felt the need to apologize rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down, too stubborn to own up to that single moment at the party. I tried to remind myself it was just a joke. This couldn't be happening because of that alone. I managed to convince myself that something else was going on, that he was dealing with a crisis at work. So I slipped on a jacket and left the house, determined to run errands, to keep living the life I had built. I would buy groceries, pick up clothes from the dry cleaner, meet a friend for coffee. But everywhere I went, I carried the sense of unease. My phone remained silent. No messages from Alex, no calls. It was a small detail, but it felt huge in its finality. Late that afternoon, I tried to plan a small gathering in our place for the weekend, a way to get us back on track socially. We always used to host dinner parties. I texted a few people, but the responses were lukewarm. One friend said she might be out of town. Another said she was busy. Another left me on read. I had never been snubbed like this before, and it stung. My mind started racing with paranoid thoughts. Did people know something I didn't? Had Alex started whispering about me behind my back? Or did I embarrass myself at the fundraiser? I forced myself to laugh at the idea, but the laughter sounded hollow even to my own ears. By the time I got home, I felt like an outsider in my own life. Darkness crept in with the sunset. and Alex arrived hours later saying nothing. There was a tension in the way he closed the front door, a quiet finality that made my skin crawl. We didn't speak a word. I lay awake that night, my mind whirling. I kept seeing that black SUV, the papers on the coffee table, the lawyer-like men who left without acknowledging me. Something big was happening, and I was in the dark. Still, I convinced myself I had to hold on. Tomorrow I'd make him talk, force an explanation. Yet, as I drifted off to restless sleep, a part of me suspected that explanations weren't going to be enough because whatever he was planning, it was already in motion, and I was starting to sense I was the last to know. The next few days passed like some surreal dream. I was stuck in a loop of partial denial and rising panic. I told myself I needed to corner him to get a real conversation going. But each time I tried, he found a way to slip away, always too busy or preoccupied with work. My texts went unanswered, or he'd reply with curt, short messages. In the evenings, he'd retreat to his office, the door firmly shut. I considered searching through his drawers or trying to log into his laptop. That's how paranoid I'd become, but I never quite worked up the nerve. The thought of confirming the worst was too daunting. Meanwhile, my own phone calls to acquaintances, to the circles we used to frequent, revealed an unspoken awkwardness. People stammered with half-hearted excuses, avoiding direct invitations. I felt like I was walking around with a flashing neon sign, outcast. Or maybe it was simply that Alex was pulling strings behind my back. He had always been the one with the real power. My role had been ornamental, a fact I'd tried so hard to ignore. Now I was forced to confront just how deeply I'd relied on him. The real blow came when I decided to pop by a networking event we'd originally planned to attend together. I showed up alone, wearing an outfit I thought would make me feel strong and confident. But the moment I walked in, I sensed eyes flicking toward me. Polite smiles, but no genuine warmth. Someone I considered a friend took me aside and murmured, "I heard you and Alex are having some issues." The pause was weighted, and I realized how naive I'd been. The rumor mill had clearly been active for days. When I tried to defend myself, to say it was just a misunderstanding, she gave me that pitying look I couldn't stand. That was my cue to leave. I drove home, feeling the first real waves of panic turning into anger. How dare he let me face this alone? Let me walk into a room full of whispers. He was my husband, wasn't he supposed to protect me? I got home ready to unleash a storm, but he wasn't there, of course. Hours passed, and I found myself once again in bed, wide awake, too furious to sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our relationship, the ups and downs, the way we laughed about stupid things, and the way he used to defend me if anyone dared say a bad word about me. Now I was facing the prospect that he might be the one orchestrating my downfall, punishing me for that one mistake. I tossed and turned, my thoughts turning ugly. What if he was done with me? What if he'd already found a new woman, someone who wouldn't make embarrassing jokes at parties? The idea fueled my insecurities, and by the time I heard the front door open at nearly 2 a.m, I was seething. I confronted him in the hallway, arms folded, voice trembling. He said nothing, just walked by. I grabbed his arm, demanding he speak, demanding an explanation. He slowly turned, looked at me with an iciness I'd never seen before, and said, "We'll talk soon." Then he pulled away and disappeared into the darkness of the house. That was the moment I realized just how one-sided this was becoming. I was the only one begging for conversation, for scraps of attention. He had the upper hand, and every time I thought I could catch my balance, he yanked the rug out from under me. The bitterness in his eyes, the complete lack of warmth, made me feel like a stranger in my own marriage. And as he vanished into the bedroom, leaving me alone in the silent corridor, I wondered if he'd already decided our fate, and I was just flailing about, trying to grasp at something that was slipping away with every hour. The knowledge that tomorrow could bring worse news made me sink to the floor, hugging my knees, not sure if I hated him or hated myself more. I found myself mentally pacing a tight circle of anger, fear, and regret. It was no longer a simple question of pride or whether I should apologize for my ill-chosen words. I could see how the entire dynamic of our marriage was shifting, and it terrified me. But what terrified me even more was realizing that, in some ways, I'd done this to myself. I just couldn't admit it outright yet. My days became consumed with anxious speculation. Was he setting things up to leave me with nothing? And if so, why was I so shocked, given I practically handed him that ammunition? In my weaker moments, I told myself that I'd only joked about being with him for status because, deep down, I thought we were untouchable, our bond uncheckable. How blind that now seemed, how arrogant. One morning, after another night of him sleeping in a separate room, I tried to approach him calmly in the kitchen. I planned what I'd say all night, a soft, remorseful tone, an admission that I was out of line. But when he looked up from his phone, my rehearsed apology crumbled in my throat. The words wouldn't come, replaced by a defensive snip. "So, are you going to keep ignoring me forever?" I snapped. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and muttered something about having important matters to deal with. No fight, no yelling, just a chilling indifference. That, for me, was worse than any argument. At least if we fought, there'd be passion, a sign that our relationship was still alive. His calmness felt like a final verdict, and I couldn't let it stand. That night, I searched for a way to reassert my importance in our social circle. I organized a small cocktail party, inviting people I thought were close to us, confident they'd rally around me. I dressed to kill, made sure the house looked impeccable. When the guests arrived, I did my best to play the gracious hostess. But Alex made a brief appearance, politely greeted everyone, and then excused himself. No one said anything, but I could sense the tension in the air. People chatted amongst themselves, casting furtive glances toward where Alex had vanished. The entire night felt hollow, like I was hosting a funeral for my marriage, under the pretense of a social gathering. By the end of it, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, the expensive dress, the forced smile, the anxious eyes, and for a moment I didn't recognize the woman staring back. After everyone left, I walked upstairs to find Alex in his office, the door ajar. He was on the phone. "No, don't worry about it," he said. "I'll handle the rest tomorrow." Then he hung up. He must have sensed me standing there because he gave me a cold glance. My stomach lurched. I demanded he tell me what was going on. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, returning to whatever documents were on his desk. The way he dismissed me was infuriating, but also heartbreaking. And again, I was left with more questions than answers, feeling like a ghost in my own home. I retreated to our bedroom, trembling, replaying all the ways I might have fixed this if I acted sooner, or apologized better, or never uttered that stupid status joke in the first place. But it was too late for regrets. Something bigger was unfolding. And I was increasingly convinced that, come morning, the cracks I kept trying to paper over would finally split wide open, revealing just how fragile my entire world had become. That morning, I barely managed to swallow a bite of breakfast. My nerves were shot. When Alex emerged from his office, I stood up straight, blocking his path. He seemed tired, as if he'd been up all night, but also grimly determined, like he'd made a decision. My heart pounded. "We need to talk," I said, my voice quivering despite my best efforts to sound strong. For a moment, he simply stared at me, and I noticed the faint circles under his eyes. He nodded toward the living room. We walked in, and I tried to steady my breath. The silence between us was deafening. Finally, he broke it. "I was going to wait until next week to tell you," he said, sitting down on the sofa while I remained standing. "But there's no point dragging this out." He paused, and I realized my palms were damp. "I've started the process." "Legally?" he added, letting that sink in. I felt my knees threaten to buckle, but I forced myself to stand. "What do you mean?" I asked, though his meaning was pretty damn clear. "Divorce," he said, calmly, as if it was just another bullet point on a business agenda. My lungs seized up. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Divorce? Over a silly comment at a party? But I saw no trace of humor in his face. He wasn't playing around. My mouth went dry, and I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, to beg him to reconsider. Instead, I just stared stunned. "But that's not all," he said, looking away. "The properties, the shared accounts, they're reverting to me. We've always had separate finances for the most part. You just used my cards." The bluntness of his words stung worse than any slap. "And you'll be changing your name back," he continued, his tone distant. "I've made sure the attorneys handle that as well. I don't want to drag this out. It's better if we're both free to move on." The enormity of his statement crashed over me like a tidal wave. Not only was he divorcing me, he was stripping me of everything that symbolized our union, our state, the access, even my last name, which I'd grown so used to wearing like a badge of honor. Suddenly, I felt the weight of those casual words I'd spoken at that party come crushing down on me. "You can't do this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We're supposed to talk things through. What about therapy? What about—" He cut me off with a gentle, almost pitying shake of his head. "Words have consequences, Emily," he said quietly. "You made it clear what I am to you. I'm not going to be that anymore." I opened my mouth to argue, to plead, but found nothing. My mind flashed back to the fundraiser, the way I leaned into that silly joke, never imagining how deeply it would slice. The memory felt like a sick joke now. I stepped closer, tears threatening to spill. He stood, not to comfort me, but to leave. As he passed me, I reached out and touched his arm. For a moment, he paused, and I thought maybe he'd soften. But then he gently pulled away, giving me one last look that said everything was final. When he left the room, I was too stunned to even cry. My world had just been shattered in a few measured sentences, delivered with the kind of composure I used to admire in him. Divorce, stripping me of status, finances, even my name. I sank onto the sofa, my heart pounding. The worst part was the realization that I'd handed him all the reasons he needed to do it. I called him a status symbol. Now, without him, I had none of that status left. The only thing left was the emptiness of this big, cold house and the knowledge that, with a few signatures, I'd be locked out of it forever. I spent the next few days in a haze, watching the pieces of my old life fall away like ash from a burned-out fire. The first blow came when I tried to log into an account for one of our joint charities, only to find I no longer had access. At first, I assumed it was a glitch password error, maybe. But after several attempts, I realized Alex had revoked my permissions. Then came the calls. The boards I'd been on, the committees I'd chaired, they started politely informing me that my role was being restructured, which was just a friendly way of saying, "We don't need you anymore." My phone rang less and less. Those who did call were either trying to get gossip or offering half-hearted sympathy. I refused to pick up, letting their voicemails pile up unheard. Part of me was too proud to let anyone see just how far I'd fallen, but mostly I was ashamed. I'd built my self-worth around my association with Alex. Without him, I was just Emily, no fancy name, no impressive connections, no reason for people to treat me like I mattered. In a moment of desperation, I tried to corner him at the house, to at least make him see how this was destroying me. But he was rarely there, and when he was, he avoided me as if I had some contagious disease. I couldn't tell if he was motivated by bitterness or genuine pain, maybe both. A quiet fury coiled in my stomach. How dare he unravel my life this way? Didn't our years together mean anything? Then a nasty voice in my head reminded me, maybe it's you who never treated them like they meant anything. My soul twisted in shame, but as much as I wanted to wallow in self-pity, I found I couldn't keep ignoring the harsh truth. My words had lit the match, and everything was going up in flames. And so it went day by day, phone call by phone call, door shut by door shut. I came across an official letter on the kitchen counter one morning, a notice confirming the initiation of divorce proceedings. Attached was a short note from Alex's lawyer, a list of the documents I needed to sign. It was surreal to see my name, my new, soon-to-be revoked, last name printed on official paper, as if it were a placeholder that could be swapped out on a whim. I thought about tearing it up, throwing it away, but I knew that wouldn't stop anything. The last spark of denial died in me that day. I started to see that maybe Alex's motivation wasn't just revenge, though it felt like that sometimes. Maybe he'd been unhappy for a long time, feeling used or undervalued, and my careless joke was the final nail in the coffin. It was a possibility that both angered and devastated me. It meant I'd been living in a bubble, oblivious to the cracks beneath my feet. At night, I found myself pacing the empty house, silent except for the occasional hum of the central air. I'd end up in the kitchen, my fingers trailing over the countertops he'd once surprised me with an extravagant remodel I'd bragged about to countless friends, claiming I'd chosen every detail. In truth, Alex had done most of the planning. He wanted to make it perfect for me. And I realized with a sinking heart that I'd really thanked him enough. Each memory that surfaced felt like a reminder of how blind I'd been, how deeply I'd taken him for granted. The sense of loss was overwhelming, and for the first time, I couldn't hide from my own role in this collapse. But that was when I discovered, almost by accident, a folder on the desk in his office. He must have forgotten to lock the door that night. Inside the folder was a set of papers outlining a timeline of financial decisions, each date meticulously recorded. He'd been planning this for months long before my careless comment at the party. My entire body went cold. This wasn't just about punishing me for one remark. He'd been waiting, preparing, as if he knew our marriage was doomed. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My words hadn't caused this. They'd merely given him the perfect excuse to finalize something he'd already set in motion. I dropped the folder and stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. All this time, I'd believed I was in control, a partner, an equal. But I was only ever a spectator, and he'd been planning his exit strategy while I flaunted the marriage as a symbol of my worth. My shock morphed into a swirl of anger and heartbreak. I was too rattled to think straight, my emotions lurching wildly. If he'd been unhappy for so long, why hadn't he told me? Why hadn't I noticed? Those questions buzzed in my head, but there were no answers in those cold, methodical documents. I stuffed them back into the folder, aware that I was trembling, and realized I might already be living on borrowed time in this house. A wave of crushing loneliness overtook me as I wondered if anything in our relationship had ever been genuine, or if it was all just an illusion that I'd so desperately clung to. Right then and there, I knew my life as I knew it was over, and I was left wondering who I was when I wasn't Emily with Alex, the wife of the man with everything. And I couldn't bear to think about how quickly I was going to find out. I started moving through the rooms like a ghost, methodically packing up small things that felt like mine alone photo frames where I looked genuinely happy. Old letters from friends, even some random knickknacks I'd had before I met Alex. Part of me felt numb, like I was on autopilot. Another part of me felt an urgent need to stake out what little was still mine, as if bracing myself for the inevitable day I'd be forced to leave. I kept waiting for him to come home so we could have it out, but every time I heard the door open, he slipped by with minimal words, locked himself away, or left again. In quieter moments, I'd stare at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing the woman I saw, red-rimmed eyes, disheveled hair, shoulders slumped with the weight of disappointment. I knew I had a choice. I could sink into self-pity, or I could try to salvage the scraps of my dignity. But that choice felt paralyzing when the ground was constantly shifting beneath me. One late afternoon, though, I mustered enough courage to walk into his office, uninvited. He was on the phone, probably with a lawyer. He ended the call when he saw me standing there, and for once, he didn't look angry, just weary, as if this was a role he never asked to play. "What do you want?" He asked softly, his tone no longer cold, but distant in a way that hurt just as much. It was now or never. I swallowed, forced myself to speak calmly. "I found the documents. You've been planning this long before our fight at the party." He didn't deny it. He just nodded as if to say, "Yes, that's true." I stepped closer, tears stinging my eyes. "Why?" My voice cracked. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he looked at me in a way that made me feel more exposed than I'd ever felt before. "I was unhappy," he said simply. "I felt like I was just your ticket. Your status symbol, maybe not always, but it crept in. And I realized you weren't really seeing me. You were seeing what I brought you." I tried to protest, but the words died in my throat. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I wanted out for a while, but I don't know. I was hoping you'd give me a reason to believe otherwise, or maybe I was too much of a coward to be honest. But then you said it, so casually in front of everyone. I'm only with him for the status, and I knew I couldn't do it anymore. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't mocking me, he was just laying out the truth. That somehow hurt more, because it was real and I couldn't spin it away. My defenses collapsed. Why didn't you talk to me? Maybe we could have worked something out. My voice sounded small. His expression didn't waver. Work what out? That I felt used and you loved what I gave you more than you loved me? The words slashed through me. Maybe I'd always secretly known it was true, but hearing it was like a punch in the gut. I stood there, tears hot on my cheeks, no idea how to respond. Alex stood, gently brushed by me, and I caught a whiff of his cologne, an oddly nostalgic scent. Before walking out, he said, "I'm sorry it had to be this way." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the office. The folder of documents on the desk, the silence practically screaming at me. My chest felt too tight. I could have run after him, but I wasn't sure what I'd say. That he was wrong? That I did love him for more than his status? Could I even convince myself of that? The questions crashed over me, one after another, and I realized with heartbreaking clarity that maybe I'd been lying to myself all along. And now the life I'd built was gone, floating away like a balloon with a severed string, and I was left staring into a future I wasn't sure I deserved. I woke up the next day and realized I was done hiding in that house. It was time to face what I'd become and see if there was a way to be someone else, someone better. I gathered a few belongings in a bag and headed for the door. Alex was in the living room, reading something on his tablet. He barely glanced at me, but I sensed a flicker of surprise. I paused, heart pounding, wanting to say something profound, but all that came out was a shaky exhale. He nodded as if he understood. There was no grand goodbye, no final confrontation, just the quiet acknowledgement that this was the end of the road we'd been traveling together. Outside, the air felt too bright, too cold, and my chest constricted at the thought of leaving behind the place I called home. But also, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe without the walls closing in. I spent the next hours wandering the city alone, drifting between cafes and shops, staring blankly at people who probably had no idea that the person crossing their path was losing her entire identity. I caught sight of a reflection in a store window, my own reflection, and realized I still carried myself with that practiced poise, a holdover from the life I'd been living. It felt hollow. I thought about calling friends, but who would I call? The ones who stayed close were probably only close because of Alex. The few I'd had beforehand had drifted away as I climbed the social ladder. Maybe I climbed too fast, too high. Eventually, I went to a small bar in a part of town I normally wouldn't be caught dead in. It was quiet, dimly lit. I ordered a drink and settled into a corner booth, letting my thoughts churn. A man a few seats away tried to make small talk, but I offered him a polite, disinterested smile. I wasn't here to flirt or to find a new anchor. I was here to figure out how to be alone with myself. Something I hadn't done in a very long time. My mind drifted back to my comment at that fundraiser, the way I'd reveled in the laughter it sparked, at least momentarily. It seemed so trivial at the time, but in truth, it exposed everything I'd been too blind to see. Status was my currency, and I'd spent years hoarding it, using Alex as a means to keep it. The bartender refilled my drink, and I stared at the amber liquid, wondering who I'd be if I stripped away the social veneer. For the first time, I felt this flicker of possibility. Maybe I could rebuild myself, even if it had to be from the ground up. But the idea terrified me too, because it meant confronting all the ugly truths I'd ignored, the shallowness of my ambitions, the way I'd let Alex carry the burden of our relationship, the way I'd never asked if he was truly happy. I realized I owed him an apology, not a desperate plea to change his mind, but a genuine acknowledgement of what I'd done. But I also knew he might not want to hear it, and maybe that was fair. As I sipped my drink, I felt tears prickling at the corner of my eyes, and I let them fall silently. I didn't care if I smeared my mascara. This was the most honest I'd been with myself in years. After a while, I left, stepping out into the crisp night air. I didn't have a plan or a destination, but I had a strange sense of resolve. I'd face whatever came next on my own. No illusions, no excuses. And so I walked, letting the city's lights blur around me, my mind swirling with the knowledge that I might never regain what I lost. The only question was whether I could find something real, something I wouldn't ruin with my own vanity. I didn't have an answer, but for once, I was willing to search for it. I ended up back at the house close to midnight, unsure if I even belonged there anymore. The divorce was in motion, and I could practically feel the walls ready to swallow me whole. But I couldn't leave things undone. I found Alex in the living room, briefcase at his feet, a glass of water in his hand. He looked exhausted, resigned. Without waiting for him to speak, I sat down across from him. For a moment, we said nothing. Then I took a breath. "I'm sorry, I managed." His expression barely changed, but I saw a flicker in his eyes. I wasn't sure if it was curiosity or skepticism. "I know I can't fix what I did," I continued, my voice shaking slightly. "I know you've been unhappy, and maybe you feel like I treated you like a stepping stone. Maybe I did, even if I never meant to. But I owe you this. I'm sorry." I wiped at my cheeks, not caring if I looked pitiful. There was no status to maintain now. Just raw honesty. His jaw tightened. He nodded, taking a slow sip of water. "I appreciate you saying that," he said quietly, and for the first time in ages, his voice held a trace of emotion. "But this changes nothing," he added, as if reading my mind. My chest tightened and I fought back tears. I managed a nod of my own. "I know," I said. "I'm not asking for you to undo anything. I just needed you to know." He set his glass down, looked at me for a long moment. "I do know," he said, almost gently. Then he stood, retrieved his briefcase, and headed upstairs. I was left alone in the quiet house, the same house I once felt so proud of, but now it felt like a husk of all my mistakes. Maybe that was the price I had to pay, to walk away with this knowledge, to carry it into whatever came next. The next morning, I packed more of my things. Alex had already left for the day, so I pinned a small note to the fridge, just 2 words: "Thank you." Not because I was grateful for how this was ending, but because, despite everything, he'd been part of a life that had shaped me, even if it was a flawed, fragile shape. Then I slipped out the door, hauling my bag behind me, stepping into a future I wasn't sure I was ready for. I spent that day arranging for a temporary apartment, a small place on the other side of town, nowhere near the upscale neighborhoods I once called home. As I signed the lease, I felt a strange sense of freedom mixed with an immense ache of loss. That night, I made dinner in my cramped new kitchen, the walls still smelling of fresh paint. The meal was simple, a far cry from the gourmet experiences I once hosted, but it was mine. I sat at the tiny table, pushing food around my plate, thinking of all the ways I'd messed up. Then I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window, and for once, I didn't immediately cringe. I was seeing myself just Emily, no illusions, no borrowed sheen of success. The darkness outside reflected my own faint outline, and I felt the weight of my choices settle in. The divorce, the name change, the loss of status, it was all real, unstoppable. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet swallow me. Maybe I'd rebuild. Maybe I'd fail. But one thing was certain. I was no longer defined by him. That thought was at once terrifying and oddly liberating. A swirl of hope and dread rose in my chest, and I realized I was at a crossroads. I could sink into regret, pining for a life I never truly cherished in the right ways. Or I could learn from this and become someone who didn't need status to feel worthy. Tomorrow, I'd take another step, maybe find a new job, maybe reconnect with old friends who knew me when I had nothing. Or maybe I'd stand on my own for a while, facing the world without the safety net I'd relied on. As I turned off the lights, preparing for my first night in this unfamiliar place, I couldn't help but wonder if Alex was relieved or hurt or both. I wondered if he'd ever think of me, if he'd regret letting me go. Those questions hung in the quiet night air, unresolved. But for the first time in a long time, I accepted that I might never know the answers. All I could do was live with the choices that led me here, and perhaps find a way to become the kind of person who wouldn't make those same mistakes twice. I woke at dawn in my tiny apartment, the sunlight creeping through the half-closed blinds, and that moment felt strangely symbolic. An unfamiliar day in an unfamiliar space, with nothing certain except that I was on my own now. I stared at the ceiling for a while, noticing tiny cracks in the plaster, like an echo of the cracks that had formed in my old life. Part of me wanted to roll over and bury myself under the covers, letting the weight of regret press me down. But I couldn't do that anymore. I forced myself out of bed and made coffee no fancy machine, just an old drip pot I grabbed from storage. The smell felt comforting and nostalgic, reminding me of simpler times. I sat by the window, sipping from a mismatched mug, letting my mind wander over the future and the thousand unknowns. In the harsh light of day, the illusions I once held about who I was and who Alex was were laid bare. It wasn't just one offhanded comment that destroyed us. It was a long history of my chasing after validation, my complacency in assuming he'd always be there, my failure to recognize that love doesn't survive on status alone. My phone buzzed a reminder from one of the social clubs about a membership renewal. Without Alex, I didn't stand a chance. Rather than respond, I deleted the message. Let them carry on without me. Maybe I'd mourn the loss later, but right now it just felt like a chain falling away. I decided to get dressed and step outside, walk the neighborhood that was slowly becoming mine. The sidewalks were cracked, the buildings older, but there was life here, people actually greeting each other with familiarity. I passed a small bakery where the smell of fresh bread made my stomach rumble. I realized I hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, subsisting on anxiety and half-hearted bites of takeout. I bought a pastry, and the older woman behind the counter smiled warmly, asking me how my day was. I answered honestly for the first time in a while. I'm not sure yet. She nodded as if she understood. As I walked away, I felt a small twinge of something like hope. Maybe this place, this new chapter, wouldn't be so terrible. My thoughts drifted to Alex again. I wondered how he spent his morning, if he felt lighter now that he cut me loose, or if there was a part of him that missed what we once had. Regardless, I realized his choices were his alone, just like mine were mine. I couldn't cling to him as my identity anymore. If I wanted to become someone who deserved a second chance, maybe not with him, but with anyone, I had to start from scratch, unlearning the toxic habits I'd let define me. That meant coming to terms with the fact that the marriage was truly over, that my name would revert back, and that my old status was gone. It meant recognizing that maybe I never really wanted that status for the right reasons in the first place. If I wanted to build something genuine, I couldn't hide behind a powerful spouse or a well-connected circle. I had to find out who I was when it was just me, flaws and all. And that might take time I'd spend stumbling, making mistakes, maybe failing again. But as I turned the key in the lock of my new door, stepping back into the small, cluttered space, a strange calm settled over me. I'd lost almost everything, but maybe I was on the verge of finding myself. I set my pastry down, took a sip of coffee, and wondered if I'd ever cross paths with Alex again. Would he recognize me if we did, or would I be someone entirely different, someone not defined by a fleeting sense of status? For now, I didn't have that answer, and maybe I didn't need it. Tomorrow would come bringing its own set of tests. All I could do was face them one choice at a time, aware that the future was wide open and that I was no longer the woman who joked about being with a man just for what he could offer. Whether or not I had it in me to change for good was another question altogether, one that lingered in the empty room with me, leaving me both hopeful and haunted.